After a nearly 10-year wait since the last game in the series, Pikmin 3 is finally here, and it brings with it some pretty big ideas and even bigger expectations, as waiting 10 years between games tends to do. So Pikmin 3 is still very much the same type of game as the previous two, in that you still manage an army of up to 100 adorable creatures called Pikmin that you can quite literally throw at all kinds of tasks. It's basically a more action-oriented, real-time strategy game. Now these tasks include taking down enemies, building bridges, destroying walls, and most importantly, retrieving all kinds of fruit that you need not only to feed yourself but also the starving citizens back on your home planet. Yep, it's very much a Pikmin game, but there's some notable differences. Like a new time limit mechanic, which strikes an interesting compromise between the hard deadline featured in Pikmin 1 and the complete lack of one in Pikmin 2. In this case, the amount of time you have left is dictated by your remaining food supply, which can actually be increased by finding more fruit. So if you run out, it's game over, though the game does generously allow you to restart from any previous day you've played. So the consequence for failure isn't nearly as harsh as it was in the first game, where you restart the entire thing from the beginning. But if you played any of the previous Pikmin games before, it's unlikely you'll get anywhere close to the game over point, as fruit is in pure abundance here. By day 4, I had more than enough food supplies that the time limit basically ceased to matter, which for me was a little disappointing as a huge fan of the first Pikmin game, but it might appeal to fans of the more laid-back Pikmin 2. Another big addition, or should I say additions, are the new Pikmin types, being rock and flying. And unlike the new types that were featured in Pikmin 2 that felt a little gimmicky, these guys are essential to making it through the game, as their unique skill sets complements the other 3 types perfectly. The rock Pikmin are immune to being squashed and are able to break through glass walls that the others can't, while flying Pikmin can reach otherwise unreachable areas on top of just being way too cute. I mean, just look at them! But one of the biggest improvements are actually the controls, at least if you're using the Wii Remote and Nunchuck. With this control method, you're able to move around and aim Pikmin completely independently, whereas if you use the gamepad, the two are tethered together, which greatly limits your speed and accuracy. But if you only play the GameCube versions of Pikmin and not the Wii remakes, this may not bother you at all. But for me, the Wii Remote controls felt fantastic, and I couldn't imagine playing this game with any other control scheme. In fact, the game's interface for the most part is much improved, allowing you to easily switch between Pikmin types even while throwing them. But it's not all better. For instance, it can no longer control the direction of every Pikmin swarm. Instead, it's been replaced by a new feature that allows you to have them all attack an enemy at once that you're locked onto. It's a little more limiting than how it worked in past games. But the bigger problem is that this command is tied to the same action as disbanding your Pikmin, which happens if you're not locked on. And since it can be hard to tell in the heat of battle whether you're locked on or not, I often ended up disbanding my Pikmin by mistake, causing them to stand around helplessly, which is the exact opposite of what I wanted them to do. But perhaps the most noteworthy change is the scale of the game. Even though the amount of levels is comparable to past games, they absolutely dwarf them in size. Whereas the previous levels are primarily made up of just one large area, they now consist of numerous sections connected by a network of passageways and caves. These levels are immense, and even a little intimidating in their scope. But fortunately, the game provides a few different ways in which to cope with these huge worlds, and one of those is by giving you 3 playable characters that you can use to control different groups of Pikmin all over the map. Now, I've never been a particularly great multitasker, so I mostly just used one character at a time, except in a few specific cases, or when the game required it to solve a few puzzles. But it does allow for a large amount of variety in how you play the game, and I imagine it will be especially useful for speedrunners. And one particularly cool feature of the multiple captains is the ability to have the captains and their Pikmin squad automatically walk to any location on the map that you choose, which then allows you to use the other characters for more immediate tasks. This actually makes multitasking far more useful than it was in Pikmin 2, though it isn't without its own drawbacks, as the group will not make any effort to avoid hazards or resist enemy attacks along the way, which can be a bit annoying. Oh, and the game makes particularly clever use of this feature during the final level, though I won't say anything more to avoid spoilers. Now, another big tool that the game provides for help with navigating the giant world is a persistent map on the gamepad that displays all kinds of useful information, such as Pikmin and fruit locations. And it's a huge help. Hell, it's basically required in order to get through the game, at least with any kind of efficiency. The thing is, I really disliked using it. For one, unless you're playing using only the gamepad, you have to keep it close by, if not right in your lap, in order to make use of the map, which is a bit cumbersome, but also the least of its problems. The bigger issue is that it's just not very good at what it does. Because there's no zoom feature, you can only ever see a small portion of the map at any given time, forcing you to scroll around it with your finger constantly. And because of the way each world is laid out, with giant empty portions separating different areas, it can be especially annoying scrolling through fields of darkness to find the one area you're looking for, especially since the game inexplicably won't let you scroll through certain portions of the map. And then there's the fact that the map isn't terribly easy to read. Basically, it's far more detailed than it needs to be, which obscures the information you actually want, such as the Pikmin locations, which are displayed as tiny dots that often blend right in with the landscape, which is especially annoying when you're trying to gather them all at the end of each day. And on top of all this, the mere act of switching my focus from the TV to the gamepad and back again is disorientating in and of itself, and frankly kind of annoying. Taken all together, I found using the map to be a cumbersome and sometimes frustrating process that greatly interrupted the flow of the game. It might sound like a minor thing, but it quickly adds up with how often I found myself accessing the map. And it's especially disappointing considering the 2 previous Pikmin games both had a map that suffered from none of these problems and worked far better, despite the fact it was relegated to a pause screen. But even putting aside the map's inadequacies, I'm actually not a huge fan of the larger worlds in general. I often found them confusing to navigate, especially with the various nearly indistinguishable passageways, and it was often tedious to traverse long distances that had nothing left to do. It sometimes got to the point where I would just set my entire group in autopilot to the required destination, just so I could avoid the tedium of walking there myself. And it's in this respect that Pikmin 3 doesn't feel quite as tight or well-paced as the previous games, even if the very core of the gameplay is as solid as it's ever been. I mean, the series has never looked better, controlled tighter, or been more accessible in terms of allowing for differing playstyles. And yet, it doesn't come together quite as cohesively as even Pikmin 2, which I also had some problems with. But with that said, there are some things the game does extremely well, such as the boss fights. These battles feel truly epic as you'll take on creatures that tower over your Pikmin army in gigantic arenas. It provides a fantastic sense of scale and also commands your full attention as there are no pushovers. And the game's overall presentation is fantastic, such as with the extremely polished opening complete with voiceover.
Due to a booming population, booming appetites, and a basic lack of planning, Kopai's inhabitants have all but exhausted their food supply.
It's almost soothing, isn't it? The Pikmin's AI has also been greatly improved, though they're still not exactly savants. Ones that are already in your squad are now able to follow you perfectly without getting hung up on the environment. Though unfortunately, this doesn't apply to Pikmin you've just summoned back, who are as liable as ever to get stuck in a wall or something. And of course, how could I not talk about how beautiful the game looks in HD? I mean, Pikmin has always been about the little things, and the Wii U's HD visuals really help bring those details out. The environments in particular look especially lush now, and the new ability to snap a picture at any time really drives that point home. The game is simply gorgeous. In addition to the main story mode, there's also a mission mode that provides a number of unique levels that offer challenges such as finding fruit or defeating enemies within a certain time limit. They didn't do much for me personally, but I can see them being addictive for those who like going for high scores. All in all, Pikmin 3 is a good game. The new Pikmin types are fun, the controls have never been better, and the entire experience is beautiful to look at, and it's all wrapped in a great presentation. But it's a game that's held back by ideas more ambitious than the interface that contains them. This is one instance where bigger isn't always better, as the game's larger scope partially comes at the expense of the more focused design of its predecessors. And it's dragged down even further by the game's cumbersome map system, which really bogs down the entire experience, when just a few tweaks could have made the entire thing dramatically more enjoyable. So I'm giving Pikmin 3 single player mode 3.5 stars out of 5. But wait, the game has a couple of different multiplayer modes too, for up to 2 players. First up is the aforementioned mission mode, which becomes a cooperative experience with 2 players, and it's even more fun for it. Especially because it demands a high level of teamwork if you really want to get some high scores. Then there's Bingo Battle, which is a competitive 2-player mode where both players battle it out to retrieve objects in the environment to be the first to complete a row on their bingo card. This mode is actually a surprising amount of fun if you can find 2 players with equal skill levels, as you try to prevent your opponent from obtaining the last item they need while trying to complete rows of your own. Regardless of which mode you play, they are a pretty fun, if not particularly deep diversion, which is why I'm also giving it 3.5 stars out of 5. Thanks for watching, make sure to keep an eye on GameXplain.com for more on Pikmin 3 and other things gaming too.